These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The light of the dying sun bled across the dusty sky, as if the heavens themselves had been shot through and wounded. The wind howled low, dragging tumbleweeds over the cracked earth, their brittle bodies skittering like bone-dry ghosts. In the Wild West, time moved slow. Heavier out here, where even the land seemed to carry its scars. There was a loneliness to it, like the silence that sat in a man's soul when everything he'd loved had withered away. Willow's Hollow was one of those towns you'd pass through and barely remember. A handful of shanty buildings, dry as the throats of the men who stumbled in, their fists heavy with wages earned from sweat or blood. A church that hadn't seen prayer in too long. A saloon with creaking doors and faded paint, and a sheriff's office where the cells sat mostly empty. Mostly. But it wasn't the kind of emptiness that brought peace. It was the kind that whispered that trouble wasn't far behind. It started, as things often do in this land, with a stranger. He came in at dusk, just as the skies were emptying their color. His shadow stretched long against the sand, framed by the creak of an old wagon wheel and the hollow clop of his horse's hooves. The stranger was lean, his face sharp enough to cut the air if he tried hard enough. His duster hung heavy from his shoulders, and his hat was pulled low to shadow eyes that didn't want to be known. He rode slow, surveying the town with a kind of practiced caution, like a man who'd had his back against the wall before. People noticed. They always noticed here because strangers were rare, and rare things usually brought trouble. Behind the cracked window of the general store, old Mrs. Garrison tightened her grip on her broom. She told herself the man was just passing through, that there wasn't enough here to hold a man like that. And frankly, there wasn't. Willow's Hollow was a dying town, drained of its hope by the constant thirst of the land and its people. But the stranger wasn't looking to pass through. He wasn't there for the saloon or a bed either. His path led him straight to the sheriff's office, where the oil lamp flickered weakly against the walls, casting shadows that lingered like regrets. The sheriff was sitting on the porch, boots planted firmly on the wooden planks, a badge that had lost its shine pinned to his vest, and a shotgun close by. At 40, he looked older. But then again, out here, life did that to a man. "You the sheriff of this hole?" the stranger asked, his voice rough as the wind over jagged rocks. Sheriff Woods raised an eyebrow, but didn't move. His grip tightened on a chipped mug of coffee. "Depends. You the kind of stranger who's got a reason to be asking." "I'm the kind of stranger who's looking for a man." "You don't say." Woods leaned forward, dust spilling off his coat like it was leaving him behind. "You looking to settle a score, boy? Or are you one of those bounty hunter types?" The stranger tugged a rolled piece of paper loose from his belt. It was a bounty poster, the ink smudged but the face clear. A hard face framed by hair like cigarette ash, eyes that looked through the world rather than at it. On the bottom, asterisk $200 alive, $100 dead, asterisk. "You seen him?" the stranger asked, his hands steady like they didn't know how to tremble. Wood sucked his teeth. His eyes flicked over the bounty. "Floyd Atkins. Robbed his third bank just last spring, didn't he? Left a whole damn town in cinders too. Shotguns aren't too particular about aim. He's here," the stranger said like it was a fact and not a question. Wood's mouth pressed flatter than a snake against rock. He stood slowly, and the weight of the little town seemed heavy on his shoulders. His fingers flexed over his belt, near his holster, but not on it. "Son," he said crisply, "if this town was harboring Floyd Atkins, don't you think it would have burned up and blown away by now?" The stranger's jaw tightened. There was something in his stance, something heavy and bent with patience, but sharp enough to snap if the wind nudged it wrong. "I don't care if this whole town goes under, Sheriff. If he's here, I'll find him, one way or another." Sheriff Woods exhaled through his teeth. "I don't like folks like you," he said almost absently, like wolves sniffing out blood when they've already had their share. The stranger didn't blink at the insult. He just nodded once, sharp as a knife. Then it's a good thing you don't have to like me. With that, he turned, his boots striking deliberate against the dirt as he untied his horse. He wasn't expecting kindness in return, and Woods wasn't planning to give it. The stranger had the stiff gait of a man who'd long since left his comfort behind, and comfort was a luxury no man west of the Mississippi could really afford anyway. As the sun dropped fully beneath the horizon and the coyotes began their long mournful cries, the stranger disappeared into the fringe of the town. One by one, the folk of Willow's Hollow turned off their lamps, locked their flimsy bolts, and whispered prayers into the dry air, though there was no preacher left to hear them. The wind kept howling. Something, not the coyotes, not the sky, not the town itself, felt restless, like the past was stirring itself awake, ready to leave ghosts in its wake. And for anyone who listened close as the night stretched long, they could almost hear the creak of a lone swing on its rusty chains behind the empty churchyard, a sound that scraped against the wind like the rattling of old bones. The morning came slow, weighted by a thick silence that felt heavier than the sun rising above the ridge. The town of Willow's Hollow stirred to life reluctantly, as if it wasn't sure whether it wanted to see another day. The saloon creaked as its double doors swung open in the wind. The yellowed curtains of the boarding houses shifted uneasily, and the dull hammering of Old Man Looper repairing a wheel echoed faintly. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful. Things here just felt on edge, brittle as dry twigs before the snap. The stranger wasn't gone. He hadn't been passing through like Mrs. Garrison had hoped. Her usually steady hand shook faintly as she tied her apron and swept the dust from her small storefront. She couldn't help but glance down the road toward the sheriff's office, toward the saloon, toward every place where trouble tended to brew in this town. She whispered to herself, "Nothing good comes from wolves chasing wolves." By mid-afternoon, the stranger stepped into the town saloon. His shadow stretched long across the dim wooden floor, his presence slicing through the faint murmur of conversation. A quiet fell across the room as folks turned their heads slightly, but not enough to meet his gaze. He moved with deliberate steps, his boots heavy, the edges of his coat dragging faintly in the dust. The bartender, a man weathered by years of liquor and old stories, eyed him carefully as the stranger leaned against the counter. "What do you need?" the man asked with a voice raspy as boards when they scratched against each other. The stranger didn't answer at first. He reached into his coat, pulling something out casually. It was crumpled parchment, the bounty paper again. He unrolled it slowly, laying it flat across the counter. His finger tapped the inked-in face of Floyd Atkins with a quiet, steady rhythm. "I need answers," the stranger said softly, his voice measured but sharp. "This man's circling your town. I intend to catch him." The bartender grunted, his brow furrowing faintly. He scanned the bounty absent-mindedly, but his hand traveled toward the glass he'd been polishing, gripping it just tight enough that his knuckles turned faintly white. "You don't sound like you're here to make friends," the bartender said. "Didn't come for friends," the stranger replied. "You think you're the first bounty hunter to look for Floyd Atkins here." The bartender leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the glass. "He's been missing for years, son. Some folks say he's dead himself, buried in the dirt without marker, and Lord knows, he deserved it." "He's not dead," the stranger said firmly, louder than before. Heads turned a little more sharply now. Folks murmured in the corners over their drinks. The faint tension in the room was thick enough to cut. "You seem awful sure of that," the bartender said carefully. There was an edge to his voice, like he was stepping over something uneven on a path that could turn dangerous fast. "I know he's not dead," the stranger replied, letting his voice drop. He pulled out another piece of parchment, older, folded and refolded, stained in places where a man's fingertips had gripped it hard. He unrolled it slowly, laying it beside the bounty on the bar's surface. The bartender's face shifted faintly. He saw it, a face scrawled in ink, drawn with the same heaviness as the bounty but bearing a different name. The resemblance was clear enough. Floyd Atkins was no stranger to bounty posters, but the name on this older page was Benjamin Atkins. The stranger's last name wasn't spoken, but it hung heavy in the air now, like the sound of a hammer striking stone. The bartender exhaled sharply, but he wasn't the only one holding onto the weight of their breath now. The folks watching from the corners of the room whispered faintly until their shadows felt louder than the day. "He's kin," someone muttered. "A brother looking for another." The stranger didn't confirm or deny the whispers. He stretched slowly, letting his back straighten slightly after being coiled for too long beneath the weight of grief and anger. "Benjamin Atkins," the bartender muttered, saying the name aloud like it left a bad taste. "So you're his kin. That boy's been missing from these parts longer than Floyd's been lighting fires. If you think kinship earns you mercy, you haven't been around here long enough." "I didn't come for mercy. I didn't come for explanations either." The stranger's eyes locked onto the bartender's suddenly. They weren't dull or dim like many who passed through Willow's Hollow. They were sharp and steely, a hunter's eyes. Eyes trained not to search, but to find. The bartender nodded faintly, as if understanding something older than whatever conversation they shared. "So, you're looking for him because it's your duty?" he asked after a long pause. "A brother's debts come first before his name. That's how it works, boy." Something passed over the stranger's face, something bitter, slow, and unspoken. "I'm looking for him because debts need settling," he said simply. It wasn't an answer meant to soothe. It wasn't meant for understanding either. It was the kind that left questions, not answers, behind. The bartender's voice softened faintly now as he laid the glass down, pointing toward the back room. "Floyd's kind comes through towns when it suits them most. They bleed places like this dry. But let me tell you something honest. That blood doesn't just flow outward. The man you're searching for, if the enemy hasn't killed him, time surely has. You better learn the difference between ghosts you chase and shadows haunting your name before they walk further beside you." The stranger didn't answer. His silence stretched faintly before he nodded. He rolled the older paper back into his coat, leaving the bounty behind as a token, not warning, but certainly a weight heavier than most rooms allowed for in the Wild West. When the stranger walked back out onto the road, folks watched him closer now. He wasn't looking for Floyd Atkins as a nameless man. He was looking for blood too, entwined with his own to ignore. And somewhere deeper into the outskirts of town, under the rustle of trees and uncertain winds, shallow whispers stirred like old bones beneath soil shifts in ways older than Earth alone. The sun bled hot that afternoon, glaring off the rooftops of Willow's Hollow and baking the town in silence so thick you could almost reach out and touch it. The stranger hadn't left, and his shadow cut across the town like a mark that couldn't be erased. The folk who had watched him walk into the saloon hadn't forgotten. Whispers traveled fast here, faster than truth ever could. The word was out now. He wasn't just some faceless bounty hunter chasing a paycheck. He had blood tied to the man he was hunting. A brother hunting a brother. Out here, in a place like this, family ties were double-edged swords. They could cut deep, slice a man right open, and bleed him dry. Folks knew it. They'd seen it before. The Wild West wasn't a place for sentiment or kinship. It was a hard land where blood didn't mean loyalty. Blood could just as easily mean betrayal. The stranger spent the rest of the day quiet, but present. The kind of presence that lingered, heavy and unwelcome. He tied his horse near the wooden fence lining an empty field just outside the sheriff's office and kept his circle small. He watched. He waited. If he was chasing shadows, he didn't want to admit it, but something in his eyes, sharp as they were, carried an uncertainty, like a man standing at the edge of a canyon too wide to cross but unwilling to step back. By the time dusk fell on Willow's Hollow, the sky above turning bruised purple with streaks of red, the stranger had moved on foot. His boots stirred the dust as he walked the edge of town, where the buildings thinned into the wilderness, open land dotted with brush and bone-dry cactus plants stretching out endlessly beyond the horizon. He wasn't walking without purpose. His steps were deliberate, slow, and measured, like a man tracking something invisible. His hand stayed close to his holster, his fingers loose and ready, and his eyes scanned the terrain like every rock and ridge carried a secret. It didn't take long for the wind to carry something back to him. The sound came faint at first, barely audible over the dry whistle of the prairie. It was the clinking of metal, sharp and rhythmic. The kind of sound a man didn't hear unless he was close to trouble. The stranger froze, his boots planting firmly into the ground, and tilted his head toward the brush ahead. His breath came shallow, deliberately soundless. He reached for his revolver, his palm sliding over the grip. Asterisk one slow step forward, then another, asterisk. As he crested the low ridge just beyond the town's edge, he saw them. 3 men, figures silhouetted in the dying light, their shadows stretching tall as giants across the sand. They stood around a wagon with broken wheels, an old mule tied slack to the yoke beside it. At first glance, they looked like ordinary ranch hands, down on their luck and stuck with a bad rig. But these weren't ranch hands, not the way they were armed. One of them held shotgun, its muzzle faintly glinting in the red light. Another had a hand already resting on the hilt of a long knife strapped to his belt. But it was the third man who caught the stranger's eye. He didn't carry a weapon, not visibly. His stance was casual, leaning against the wagon like trouble had never touched him. Trouble didn't need to touch a man like that. He brought it with him. His face was longer, lean, and worn from years of exposure to the kind of sun that didn't forgive. His eyes were faintly hooded, cold enough to freeze a rattlesnake on sight. Floyd Atkins. The stranger didn't need to see the fading poster hanging in his coat to confirm it. The face was the same, sharp, hard lines carved into a cruel life, with eyes that never softened. There was no mistaking him. Floyd wasn't hiding from life. He was living it exactly the way he wanted to. And the men standing with him weren't his captors. They were his kind. The stranger shifted his weight slightly, leaning into the cover of the ridge. His hand tightened around the grip of his revolver. He didn't move further, not yet. He let the men keep speaking, though their voices were too faint for him to pick apart. The wind carried snippets that told him enough. Smuggling, guns, something heavier, something worth moving bodies across the stretch of lifeless earth like cattle for slaughter. The stranger hadn't seen his brother in years, but he'd known this was coming. Floyd wasn't just a man who'd stepped off the righteous path. He'd carved a new path of his own, and it led nowhere good. The stranger didn't know whether anger or grief settled heavier in his chest. Both worked like weights, dragging him deeper into a darkness no man liked to drown in. The conversation had shifted suddenly. The man with the knife gestured sharply toward the valley. They were planning to move. The stranger tensed, his body coiling tightly, like a desert snake about to strike. He could hear his breath now, low and shallow. And just as he signaled his next move, his footing wavered. A loose rock rolled free beneath his boot. The sound wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The man with the shotgun snapped his head toward the ridge. "Who's there?" His voice struck clear across the field, carrying the warning like a hammer to glass. The stranger stepped back instinctively, ducking lower, his pulse hammering against his chest. He cursed himself, but it was too late. Voices rose behind him. Movement followed. He heard the clink of the knife being drawn from its sheath, the shuffle of boots on rock. Floyd didn't shout. He didn't lift his hand. His voice, a low, deadly drawl, cut through the growing tension like a branding iron. "Whoever you are up there, come on out. No use hiding from eyes that already see you." The stranger didn't move for a long moment. His hand tightened over his revolver. He could take them, maybe. But 3-to-1 odds in an exposed position like this weren't odds any smart man would bet on. Not unless it was necessary. He thought of the bounty taped to the wall in the sheriff's office. The reward for dead weighed lighter than the reward for alive. One step forward. The stranger rose slowly from his cover. He forced his breathing to steady, his hand resting casually, but close to his weapon. His eyes locked onto Floyd's. The man didn't react, at least not visibly. His face was blank. "You've been found," the stranger said flatly. His words carried no pride, only weight. "Have I now?" Floyd tilted his head faintly. Beneath his indifferent gaze, something faint flickered amusement. but it didn't reach his tone. And who's the one doing the finding? The stranger stepped closer, his boots dragging deliberately deep into the sand, like a man leaving tracks meant to hold weight. Your brother, Benjamin Atkins. For the first time, something in Floyd's mouth twitched faintly. Not quite a smile, but something in the shape of it. He glanced at the two men beside him briefly, before turning back to the stranger. Well, Floyd said softly, you came all this way looking for me. I suppose the only question left is why you thought you could bring me back. Tension hung in the air, thick as the desert before a storm. The silence that stretched between them was a thing alive. It pressed down on the stranger's shoulders, coiling tight around his chest with every second that ticked by. Floyd's face, his sharp, carved features, barely shifted, but there was something in his eyes that cut deeper than words ever could. They were the eyes of a man who had turned his back on something long ago and had never thought to look back. Your name's been following me all my life, Floyd said finally, his voice low and smooth, like poison slipping from a rattler's fangs. He tilted his head, casually resting his palm against the wagon's edge. But I can't recall sending for you, Benjamin. Did I? He didn't wait for an answer. No, I didn't. So tell me, why do you think this meeting was meant to happen? The stranger, Benjamin, didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight, keeping his stance rooted, his hand near enough to his revolver to signal he wasn't a man to be trifled with. But this wasn't about the bounty. Not anymore. This wasn't a clean job designed to end with a signature in blood. This was about something tangled beneath the surface that no words could untangle all at once. I'm not here for talk or lecture, Benjamin said finally. His voice was steady but edged. And I'm not here to right your wrongs, Floyd. But you're wanted, dead or alive. The two men behind Floyd stiffened at the words. The one with the shotgun glanced toward Floyd quickly, searching his face for some kind of signal. The knife wielder didn't look nearly as patient. His hand twitched faintly, tightening around the blade like it was itching to bite into something. Floyd waved them down slowly, his hand raising just enough to still their tension. Boys, he said softly, smiling faintly, I'd like a moment with my brother, if you don't mind. The men hesitated, but didn't question him. That was the thing about Floyd Atkins. His words carried weight enough to hold even violent hands at bay. The shotgun fell slack against the other man's arm, and the knife was sheathed again. Slowly, the two of them backed off, retreating toward the shadows of the wagon. That left the brothers face to face, alone in a field that felt bigger and quieter than it should have. Benjamin didn't shift. His pulse hammered against his ribs, steady and hot, but his body was locked in place. He knew better than to trust his brother's disarming gestures. Floyd had always been a man who moved like smoke. His intentions were never where you first thought they landed. Benjamin glanced toward Floyd's hand. It was resting casually against his hip, near enough to his own weapon to make the air between them feel alive with tension. You came here chasing something you don't understand, Floyd said lazily, breaking the silence once more. You think because you've got my name and it just cause riding beside you that it means something out here. He chuckled faintly, shaking his head. But you're no different from any other bounty hunter sniffing for coin and glory. You bought into the story the law fed you, didn't you? Floyd Atkins, the outlaw who burned nations to the ground. Floyd's voice dropped lower, colder. His smile flattened. But you never stopped to ask yourself why. Did you, little brother? Benjamin's jaw tightened. The words didn't hit like a revelation. They struck like a hammer breaking open something he already knew was there. But that didn't mean it didn't cut. He stared Floyd down hard, refusing to blink, refusing to budge even an inch. Asterisk, why asterisk you chose to do what you did doesn't matter, Benjamin said curtly. The result's the same. Towns burned. Families murdered. You left ash and graves in your wake, Floyd. There's no justice that lets you walk away without paying for what you've done. Floyd's eyes met Benjamin's without faltering, but something faint flickered in his expression this time. Something like amusement, something almost bitter. He dropped his hand casually from his side, raising both palms slowly in a gesture of mock surrender as he stepped forward into the dying sunlight. "Justice," Floyd repeated, his tone dripping sarcasm. "Justice is what made me what I am, Benjamin. Justice is what they called it when they sent 12 men in blue coats to burn our farm. Justice was their excuse when they left Ma and Pa to rot in the fields they tilled their whole lives." Benjamin felt the words like a sharp punch to his gut, a memory he tried to bury, pushing it deep down like stones into the earth, began to rise. Floyd sneered when Benjamin didn't speak. "You want to know why? Here it is, brother. It's simple. If the law's gonna treat the innocent and the devil's the same, then I figured I'd just learn to play in the devil's den." "You think that makes it right?" Benjamin snapped, the words spilling sharp between his teeth before he could stop himself. His voice came harder than he planned, the anger he'd buried beneath guilt bubbling hot, like oil meeting a flame. "You think that excuses what you did, what you've done since." Floyd stopped walking. His eyes darkened faintly. He spoke slowly now, drawing out the venom behind every syllable. "Do you ever think about how Ma begged, Benjamin?" His voice was soft, too soft. "You ran. I stayed. And she begged me to keep you alive before they dragged her into the barn." The air went stark still. Benjamin's breath hitched, but he swallowed it down hard, fighting the memories clawing at his composure. He tightened his grip on his pistol, but his hand stayed at his side. "See, I did my duty," Floyd continued with a slight grin, though it didn't carry real joy. "Ain't my fault the law rewarded me with blood and fire. So maybe you're here to finish me now. But tell me, Ben, you sure you're the better man for it?" Benjamin didn't realize his hand had moved until his weapon was half raised. His knuckles were white around the grip, his face deliberately locked in a mask of focus. Floyd didn't flinch. He just stared at the barrel, his figure still, his hands still slack. The knife-wielding man stepped forward from the shadows, his weapon gleaming faintly in the last rays of light. "Boss," he started, his tone cautious, "if you're done—" "Shut up," Floyd snapped without turning to him. His gaze was locked onto Benjamin. "Go on, brother. Pull the trigger. Show me how different you really are." Benjamin's heart pounded loud in his ears, drowning out even the faint rasp of the knife scraping metal as the man stepped closer behind Floyd. The world felt tighter, smaller. There wasn't enough room for both of them, but Benjamin didn't fire. Instead, he spoke through clenched teeth, his voice steady but low. "I didn't come here to kill you," he said finally. His arm began to lower, slow but deliberate. "I came to bring you in for what you've done. Lawfully." Floyd's mouth curved faintly, the edges of a smile, but not of humor. "Lawfully." He spat the word like it was poison. "No one lives lawfully out here. That's your first mistake, Ben." The knife struck then, flashing out from the shadows, its edge aimed clean for Benjamin's torso. The outlaw's second man moved fast, expecting hesitation. But Benjamin was faster. His revolver snapped upward, and there was a crack like thunder tearing across the field. The man dropped as the knife hit the sand. Floyd didn't wince. He didn't shout. He let out a low chuckle instead, filled with something dark and knowing. "Looks like you came into this fight half right at least," he murmured. The balance between the brothers tipped. This wasn't justice anymore. It was survival. The crack of the shot hung in the air long after the knife-wielding man hit the ground. It echoed out across the dry valley, stirring uneasy wings in the distance as crows fled the trees like shadows peeling off the land. For a brief, gasping moment, everything stopped. The world seemed frozen in the instant between the draw of breath and the exhale to follow. Benjamin held firm, his revolver aimed dead center at Floyd now. His body was coiled tight like the spring of a trap, every nerve in him screaming for control. His hands didn't tremble, his jaw was set firm, but inside, a storm had been raging since the moment he'd squeezed the trigger. The man at Floyd's side, the one with the shotgun, had gone still, his hands rising just above his waist, unsure whether to make a move or back into the shadows, like a jackal retreating from a lion. "This is done," Benjamin growled, his voice sharp and clear. "No more chasing. No more running. You surrendered this fight the moment your gun stayed in its holster. Floyd didn't move an inch. His expression, sharp and detestable, didn't flicker. Not when the revolver pointed steady at his chest. Not when his own man lay bleeding in the dirt beside him. There was something unnatural in the way he stood, unmoved, like he'd sized Benjamin up in that moment and decided his little brother wasn't half the danger he claimed to be. "You planning to shoot me down, Benjamin?" Floyd asked finally, his voice calm, as though they were simply two ranchers haggling over a mule. "Seems like a waste of work to ride all that distance just to put another hole in the dirt." "My job isn't to kill you." Benjamin's tone cut clean across the space between them, short and sharp. "It's to bring you in, for everything you've done. You want to taunt me with your stories, talk about who abandoned who, but we both know the facts, Floyd." Floyd tilted his head faintly, his lips curving into something unpleasant, something lighter than a sneer, but carrying the same weight. "The facts, huh? We're talking about the ones the law prints for their papers, or the kind that end up engraved on tombstones? 'Cause you and I remember Ma and Pa's story different, and from where I'm standing, neither one of us was innocent." The words struck like steel, but Benjamin's revolver didn't waver. His pulse pounded behind his ribs, each steady beat stronger than the last, as though the force of his heart hammering against his chest could drown out his brother's voice. He tightened his grip, harder now, knowing it would leave marks even through the leather, but grounding himself in that contact. Pain had a way of keeping a man anchored, even when the world wanted to drag him loose. "You ran this time long before anyone else had the choice to," Benjamin said, his words quiet but cutting. "You wanted out, didn't you? You wanted to burn so bright the rest of the world would forget what you left behind. And now what? You think your excuses matter to me, to Ma. They buried Charity with our family long before you ever started burying bodies." Floyd stopped smiling. His eyes, hooded but sharp, changed faintly. Whatever flicker of amusement had carried through their earlier exchange faded completely, leaving something jagged and hard beneath, a layer even his calloused smirk couldn't smooth over. "This'll end badly for both of us," Floyd murmured then. Quiet enough the shotgun-wielding man had to glance twice for certainty he'd heard. "You don't reel wolves back to the den without bleeding in the process." Benjamin's patience was worn thin. He could hear it in his own voice snapping sharply across the drying air when he replied again. "Say what you want to say, Floyd. Move how you want. But if that's your subtle way of asking me to give up, you might want to add another name to those burial rites today." Another stretch of silence passed between them. Floyd didn't move forward. He didn't retreat either. The distance hadn't grown, but it might as well have divided entire worlds between them at that moment. The setting sun peeled back from the valley, casting violet shadows long and lean over the figures standing motionless in the clearing. Benjamin didn't say more. His chest rose and fell faintly now, steady as practice, restrained even when the atmosphere itself screamed for release. Floyd, ever the gambler, tipped his hat low just enough to obscure part of his sharp features. When his next words came, they didn't carry the venom Benjamin expected. Instead, they came faintly lighter, mocking faintly but raised softer than earlier insults. "You think you're righteous carrying that badge's weight so many steps off the courthouse porch? I see yours ain't pinned exactly like my own," he said finally, his tone smooth as snake smoke. "What part's hard for you? Facing lies in double fights, or showing you'll empty significant refusals?" The reply was harder to parse, the doubt stirring translucent, resigning, heavy shifting unto Floyd's sentence before echoes damped beneath. The pale light of dawn was cresting the horizon, painting the sky with a dull, dusty gold that bled into the desolation below. The bodies of the fallen men lay still in the sand, their shadows stretching far and long, as if they were reaching for something beyond themselves. The battle, the rage, the tension, it all had reached a boiling point, but now the air was almost hollow. It carried a haunting kind of calm, the kind that follows a storm too quiet to truly be finished. Benjamin stood over Floyd now, his revolver steady in his hand, his breathing labored but stable. The blood on his boots had dried to an angry shade of rust, and the scrape across his jaw painted his face in lines of exhaustion. He hadn't blinked in minutes. His eyes felt heavy, his vision blurry, but his mind, his heart, held onto clarity with a kind of desperation. They were brothers, tied by blood, split by choices, and now trapped in the last remnants of what had started so many years ago. Only one path was left. Floyd was staring back at him, dark, calm, still too sharp even after everything. He hadn't drawn his weapon, hadn't flinched when Benjamin's shot rang out and dropped his knife-wielding man to the ground just moments earlier. His smirk was gone now, replaced by something colder, more calculating, perhaps even resigned. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Floyd said quietly, his voice low but steady, cutting through the silence like a blade slipping into flesh. "You didn't just come here for justice. You didn't come here to play sheriff, for the badge pinned to your chest. You came here for me, to pour salt on a wound that's already bled itself dry." Benjamin didn't respond right away. He couldn't. His grip tightened faintly around the revolver, the weight of the weapon dragging heavily against the tension in his muscles. He forced his breathing to settle, pulling air into his lungs with deliberate precision. His heart hammered so hard it felt like it was shaking his ribs, but his face stayed locked, unmoving. "I came here," he said slowly, his voice thick and deliberate, "to put you where you belong, Floyd, for everything you've done, for all the lives you stole, all the towns you burned, all the graves you filled. You've spent your time playing the outlaw, hiding behind excuses and stories about what made you this way. But none of that changes the truth." "And what truth is that?" Floyd murmured. Benjamin's glare sharpened. "You killed the innocent for your grief. You took revenge to fill the hole Ma and Pa left behind. But instead of just taking it out on the man who wronged us, you turned everything you touched into ash. You could have walked away. You could have stopped. But instead you built a world designed to destroy itself." Floyd stared at him for a long moment, long enough that the tension felt like it would snap between them. His lips twitched faintly. He shook his head once, slowly, like he was looking at something pitiful. "You're wrong, little brother," he said quietly, but his voice carried something uneven this time. "I didn't build this world alone. You had your hands on the cracks long before I started breaking them." The accusation was sharp, biting, but Benjamin didn't flinch. He knew Floyd's games too well. Words were one of his sharpest weapons, second only to the pistol that still lingered, holstered and untouched, near his hand. Benjamin gritted his teeth, inhaling sharply when a memory flickered against the edge of his thoughts like a spark threatening to ignite a wildfire. The farm, the barn, Ma, Pa, the figures clad in blue who came to enforce their so-called justice. All those blurry images started to fight their way free from the dark corner Benjamin had spent years locking them away in. He told himself this was Floyd's burden to bear, not his. But standing here now, he couldn't deny the weight pressing down on his shoulders. The knowledge that he'd been there, that he'd run, that the last thing he'd heard was Ma begging as Floyd whispered to her. "You think you're different from me," Floyd said after a moment of heavy silence. His voice softened faintly, but the dark edge to his tone hadn't eased. "You think standing there with your shiny badge and high moral ground means you're better. But the truth is, you wanted this. You wanted an excuse to act on the anger you buried every day since we left that barn. And now you've got it." Benjamin clenched his jaw tighter still. The revolver in his hands trembled faintly now. Not out of fear, but something harder to name. Maybe grief. "This isn't about the past anymore," he said at last, forcing the words through his throat. "This is about ending the damage you've done. It doesn't matter what Ma and Pa would think about us now. It doesn't matter what's buried back at the farm. You crossed too many lines, and it's time for someone to put a stop to it." Floyd's smirk returned faintly, a shade of its earlier sharpness, but quieter now. He tilted his head faintly, letting the brim of his hat shield his eyes as he stepped forward. His boots dragged softly through the dust, deliberate and slow, each step planting him nearer to the revolver's barrel. "You really think you've got what it takes to end this?" Floyd murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared straight into Benjamin's gaze now, his expression unreadable. "Let's see it, little brother. Pull the trigger. If this is justice, you shouldn't need to hesitate." Benjamin didn't move, not at first anyway. He tightened his grip on the revolver, inhaling slowly, deliberately. He could feel every ounce of weight pressing against him now. Not just the steel in his hand, but the shadow of the memories Floyd kept stirring up. The raw tension pulling at his muscles, the eyes of the town that would judge him for what came next. This wasn't just about capturing Floyd. It never had been. It was about everything they'd left behind, everything he'd spent years trying to escape. Floyd had made his choice long ago, but now Benjamin had to make his own. And this time, it wasn't just about survival. The sun broke over the horizon, casting long beams of pale light across the field. Benjamin exhaled harshly, lowering the revolver slowly, inch by inch, until it hung slack at his side. His jaw trembled briefly, clenching one last time before he spoke. "You're coming with me," he said finally, his voice firm, steady, alive. Floyd stared at him. For the first time all day, his expression shifted faintly, not with anger, not with amusement, but something quieter. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He simply nodded faintly. Benjamin holstered his weapon as Floyd raised his hands. The last shadows of the ridge disappeared as the brothers stepped forward, one toward the law, the other toward reckoning too heavy to carry alone anymore. As the dust settled and the hollow silence returned to the Wild West, their shadows stretched long across the horizon. The wind whispered faintly as Benjamin led Floyd back to town, but for the first time that day, it didn't carry the weight of violence. It carried something quieter, something heavy, but perhaps finally unyielding. Justice. "See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you."